The Memory of Love is a novel, and it is set in Sierra Leone in West Africa, where part of my family come from. It's told in three voices. The voice of an elderly man who is more or less on his deathbed, and he tells his story of his life, and particularly of a love affair with a woman he loved in the 1960s and early 1970s, to a young British psychologist. The British psychologist is called Adrian, and he has come to that country in the wake of war. He wants to help, but he is finding help harder to give than he thought. It turns out that he ends up with only one client, and that client is this man, Elias Cole, who tells him his story. Adrian has to judge the story to decide who Elias Cole really was when he was a young man. And then the third character is a young African surgeon called Kai Mansere. Kai Mansere is idealistic, hard-working, but he's also conflicted. He has suffered in the war himself. He suffers a trauma, desperate insomnia, but he will not admit it to himself and tries his ways to try to work through it, as it were. At the same time, he has a friend in America who also studied with him and who encourages him to leave, as once was their dream. I didn't go back to my roots to write this story, and that I never left my roots behind. I've always lived in both countries, in Britain and in Sierra Leone. The bulk of my family, in fact all my family, but one other member on the Sierra Leonean side lives in Sierra Leone. My British side live in Britain. So I've always gone back and forth. Of course, during the war years it was very difficult to do that because of the security situation, but I went back towards the end of the war. I did forensic research when I was in Sierra Leone because I had been as ambitious as to make one of my characters an orthopedic surgeon. There's a story behind that. I was in Sierra Leone, I was running on the beach, this is towards the end of the war. I broke my Achilles tendon. While I was there, I had to be treated at a local hospital. And I had to be flown back to Britain. But when the hospital I went to was a volunteer-run hospital for amputees, because of course the terrible atrocities that had characterized that war were hacking off people's limbs. So in a way, it was exactly the right place to go. There were lots of orthopedic surgeons there. I became really fascinated by the atmosphere of the hospital. You know, that everything outside was so chaotic and people were killing each other. And in the hospital, everything was so calm and people were engaged in the act of trying to save life. And the further that you went into the hospital, almost like you went to the operating theatre as the nucleus of the hospital, that was the place where it was utterly calm, and I was really fascinated by the surgeons. You know, they're almost like conductors, the way they work, and they work in perfect harmony with each other towards the life of saving a patient. After I broke my tendon, I was operated on in England actually, and then I went back to Sierra Leone. I asked this hospital, could I observe for a bit. I told them that I was working on a novel, and they let me spend time with some of their surgeons. And that's where that came from. I'm born on the cultural crossroads between Sierra Leone and Britain, south and north, and I also grew up in different places when I was young, not just Sierra Leone and Britain, but also because my mother's second husband was a diplomat in countries like Iran and in Thailand. So I have always sat in that position. I've always been obliged to interpret, mediate for other people, and to understand for myself that, you know, there's more than one way of doing things wherever you are in the world. Not everybody does everything the same way. With The Memory of Love, I created an outsider figure, the figure of Adrian, the psychologist who goes to Sierra Leone. My last two books have been set entirely in that country, purely with all Sierra Leonean characters. But with The Memory of Love, I wanted something quite particular to happen. I wanted the reader, wherever they were from, you know, whether they were from Ghana or from Syria or from Papua New Guinea, I wanted the reader, whoever it was who didn't know that country, to come into it, to be able to use Adrian as the lens through which they saw the country, to hear Elias Cole's story through his ears and to have to make the very same judgments about Elias Cole that Adrian in the end finds himself driven to make. So there was a very particular narrative device in the character of Adrian. We see the story through three people's eyes, through Elias Cole's eyes, his account, through Adrian's eyes, he has his own narrative strand, and also through the eyes of Kai Mansaray, because Kai Mansaray, of course, is the person who can see Adrian, who's the newcomer, and who doesn't really understand the country. And Kai's role, he's Adrian's friend, but he's also a critic of him. He's a critic of Westerners like Adrian, who turn up in the wake of war and who believe they can fix things, but who haven't really tried to understand, who are in a way too arrogant really to try to understand. And that's what Adrian's difficulty is, both with his patience and with Elias Cole, is that he has to adopt a certain, he has to change his frames of reference, and he has to open himself to learning about this country. And one of the things that Kai Mansaray does is he helps him do that. The three narratives interweave, and of course Elias Cole's narrative goes back to the 1960s a lot, so you move between the three narrators and you move back and forward in time. Technically the way I wrote it is that Elias Cole tells his story in the first person. He tells it straight to Adrian and therefore in that sense straight to the reader, whereas with Kai and Adrian's section, I actually wrote them in the third person, but with a single perspective, the perspective of each character. You know, the Memory of Love is a title that came actually quite early on with my books. I seem to find the title very early or not at all, really, and it all becomes a struggle at the end to find a way of talking about the book in three words that make a title that will evoke something. The Memory of Love actually came from a conversation that I had with a man who was a specialist in pain. And he told me that when a limb is amputated, people continue to feel pain in that limb later on. Long years after it's gone, they'll often wake up at night feeling pain in the arm or leg that isn't there anymore. He was a pain specialist, and this was his particular area of study. He'd come to Sierra Leone to try to help the amputees. And what he told me was, he said, what they've begun to understand is that pain is felt in the brain, in fact. It's felt in the synapses of the brain. And therefore they stopped calling it phantom pain, because the pain that these people were feeling was actually real. It wasn't imagined. Now, when I was thinking about the character of Kai, Kai has a lost love. Somebody who his love for didn't survive the event that happened to him during the war. He grew too distant from her and they ended up breaking up, but he still thinks about her. And so I use the memory of pain and the memory of love as interchangeable ideas. Kai tells himself he doesn't really love her. It's just the memory of the love that is causing him distress, but in fact, well, you know, does he really love her, or is it a memory? Well, I mean, the reason I write about Sierra Leone is very, very simple. Nobody else is, you know. So, I mean, there are enough writers writing about Britain. My family's Scottish. There are, frankly, enough Scottish writers. Sierra Leone is simply, you know, hasn't produced writers for reasons of economy, history, education. So, you know, there was a very strong pull to tell that narrative. But also, we had a war, and as a novelist, it would seem to me a total dereliction in duty not to write about the most important thing that had happened in your country's history. I mean, one of the things I really like about talking about my work in the context of, say, the Jaipur Festival or the Gaul Festival, where I was last year, is that different audiences have different responses to it. My response in Britain I'm very familiar with, and it tends to come from a very colonial perspective. Whereas, of course, when I talk to African audiences, I get another perspective again, and of course, they get a lot of the jokes that the British and American audiences don't get. When I went to Sri Lanka, or when I'm in Spain, for example, people really want to talk about war. You know, they really want to talk about war. And I think when I come to a country, I mean, I have yet to give my session on the memory of love, but I suspect that one of the things we're going to talk about, because we did today at another session, is really that historical the historical pattern that we've all had of sort of trying to move towards democracy, and what our individual responsibility is as citizens of countries that are really in historical terms only relatively recently democratic to make that happen.